Thank you very much. Let me just put a timer here so I won't go over my time. Oh, yes. Great. Yeah, thank you. And then. So, first of all, thank you very much to Cosmin and Parasite, Anki and Celia for the organization, and Savi as well as a partner. I'm very happy to be here. It's the first time that I'm in Hong Kong. So thank you for the introduction as well. Just to add that the institution is now about 7 years old, and obviously by its name, as Anchi mentioned, there is a bit of a fetish or an infatuation with the state. So I'm looking at the art institution as a paradigm and how we can actually think of it through what Italian theorist, political theorist Antonio Gramsci called counter-hegemonies. So currently, I'm looking at current power formations via state theory and political science, as well as psychology, to describe a new state formation that is emerging globally, and to look at it vis-à-vis culture and the current discussions that exist on the contemporary art field on art versus politics. So I will bore you a little bit with a bit of heavy theory, but we'll hopefully go to art quite soon. So as the world is turning to the right, nationalist and racist politicians surface all around, and this is a phenomenon that is literally spreading like a virus currently. The sad thing, of course, is that in most cases they are elected officials. That said, the means through which they are elected can be criticized, putting an asterisk here on the case of Cambridge Analytica, which I will elaborate back on this in a while. I would like to look into this new state formation emerging and discuss the way that certain cultural practices are responding to it. These responses include proposing counter-hegemonic power blocks so as to construct an imaginary for other forms of emancipatory power structures, as well as actually infiltrating these structures themselves. Primarily, if we are to start from the state as such, it's crucial to recognize that it has always been a complex structure from the times of the ancient Greece and its demos. What my research is interested in is the state and its form as a symbolic prototype, as a complex structure, one that is organic, that it metabolizes constantly, metamorphosing also while attending or looking at the rifts and the shifts of society. So this symbolic prototype is almost universal, for good or worse. It's Eurocentric, unfortunately, comes from after Westphalia, and is a total expression of power. It's composed by law and order, by institutions, and also its subjectivity is therefore the citizens that occupy it. Art institutions, even if they're not state-run, in many cases they are not, as mine in Athens as well, they are dependent on its laws, permissions, and somehow they mimic its infrastructures, its hierarchies, and its mechanism. And of course here we can say there have been several paradigms of institutions that experiment with breaking these models through institutional critique, horizontal structures, economies of exchange, etc. I think it was fantastic that we had all these great examples yesterday of that. Just to focus a little bit on the state as a concept, I will look into three, sadly male, no females, male theorists that have analyzed the state. So first of all is sociologist Bob Jessup, that has argued, and I quote, that there can be no general, let alone transhistorical theory of the state. Now, to go very, very back, Max Weber, which is one of the kind of famous state theorists, in his lecture Politics as a Vocation from 1918, so it's like 100 years old already, the state is defined as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And we're referring to that mostly as the monopoly of violence. Of course, it's a monopoly of legalized violence in that sense. His writings demarcate the three-element approach of state theory, which is territoriality, violence, and legitimacy. Now, most of state theory again, looking from the Western position throughout the last century, has not delineated from Weber's understanding of the state until Bob Jessop recently, in his new book, State, Past, Present, Future, introduced through this book a fourth element to this theory, the idea of the state. And this is extremely interesting for me, the conceptualization of the way that the state somehow presents itself. I will also talk a little bit here about a Greek political theorist that is not very known, Nikos Pouladjas, who understood the state as a social relation, as a variable, as he said, not a passive tool, therefore, or a neutral actor, but a relationship of forces. And these are two fantastic books of his. One was recently republished by Verso, which I completely recommend. Now, he pointed out that features of the political order previously thought as exceptional and temporary, such as in times of dictatorship, and he was writing this in the late 70s, just after, of course, Greece, Portugal, and Spain were coming out of dictatorships, were in the late 70s becoming increasingly normalized in what he named authoritarian statism of the capitalist state. So this exceptionality, of course, is what is extremely interesting for me at this very moment. And I quote, he wrote, "State control over every sphere of socio-economic life, combined with radical decline of institutions of political democracy and with draconian and multiform curtailment of so-called formal liberties." I mean, he wrote that in the at the end of the 70s, when he saw, of course, a world market slowly becoming integrated. 40 years later, the global market has integrated considerably more, and we witness a state transformation with the advancement of capitalism. I mean, now we are in what Naomi Klein calls turbo-capitalism. Now, in his magnificent book, The Poorer Nations, Vijay Prashad tracks the history of this transformation through the liberal ideologies of the 70s that basically broke with the Bretton Woods framework of the IMF and the World Bank, by imposing new formations of extra states like the G7, of course, whilst they were crushing the new international economic order, the NIEO, and the non-aligned movement, which is resurfacing now a lot in cultural practice, and a lot of artists and theorists and curators are kind of revisiting it and its histories. So, of course, we can thank Henry Kissinger here and Helmut Schmidt for their shady deals. Today, the face of power has an even more opaque look. The whole globe is affected by the decisions of trans-state formations like the IMF that since the late 80s are masking their interference in countries with developing economies as aid. So in the case of my native Greece, for instance, that received bailouts the last 8 years now, the IMF proposed extreme austerity and high interest rates for their loan, and after, of course, they gave the money, they said, oh, their plan was like a little bit too strict and maybe a little bit faulty. So it's crucial for me here to see the colonial character of such operations. The knowledgeable white men in the suits teach healthy financing and progress to the less advanced economies. And as proven, it seems they do not know exactly what they're doing. We just need to see what the IMF did in the case of Argentina in the early 2000s, Mexico in the 90s, or similarly to Greece, Ghana, which is another recent example that received a bailout in 2015, where in fact lenders were benefiting at about 11% interest rate because the IMF actually was a guarantor of this loan, and who paid for that was the Ghanaian people. Of course, it's absolutely funny to read 3 days ago the statement of the new IMF head, Kristalina Georgieva, stating that all countries should unite to deal with the global economic slowdown. Or maybe it's not so funny, actually. To make our conundrum even bigger, we don't have these extra states alone together with states, but we also have other power structures forming and affecting the state, such as the trillion-dollar companies. Now, they influence or bypass state power, they manipulate or cajole states to accommodate their interests, they're performing surveillance, and they control data and metadata, thus accumulating global power. And I'm just putting a note here that there are so many people from anthropology, from political science, and from civil society trying to push for data to become a human right. So, the scandal of Cambridge Analytica that I referenced before received a lot of mainstream attention, but it was mostly for its involvement in the Brexit and the US elections. But nonetheless, the most horrifying example of Cambridge Analytica's modeling with elections is the example of Myanmar, and as well, of course, Facebook's power in the country, that through hate campaigns and false news resulted to the murder of a large part of a Muslim population. Not one person from that company has been accountable for these actions. And just to put a note, what Cambridge Analytica basically did was declare bankruptcy so that no one had access to their files, so the trials could not continue. And there is quite a good documentary on Netflix, actually, by all places. It's called The Great Hack, which I recommend for you to see. So for me, what is interesting here as well is the non-accountability factor. So the agents of power are coming both from state and extra-state structures and corporate structures, and they perform a contemporary version of Puladja's authoritarian statism that I call narcissistic. So the narcissistic personality disorder is defined by psychiatry as one that is characterized by feelings of grandiosity, a complete lack of empathy for others, immense need for admiration and domination over others, preoccupation by power and success. Oh, I don't know where that came from. So, immense need for admiration and domination over others, preoccupation by power and success, and compulsive lying. So, narcissistic authoritarian statism is at the gates. So think of this in relationship to all these crazy characters that are actually ruling us. The psychological portrait of the Trumps, Putins, Dutertes, and Modis of the world is beautifully painted by writers such as Eve Ensler. She's the writer of the Vagina Monologues. She's a writer that lives in New York. In a 2018 collection of fictional essays titled Strong Men, again, it's edited by Vijay Prasad. It's a very entertaining read. I also recommend that. So she portrays Trump as the carrier of a virus that is injected into the populace, and I quote, through angry, white hate-filled spittle, slimy superlatives, sham-filled promises, and toxic red caps, which allowed the virus to seep in through the follicles and the hair. In her story, Trump is, again a quote, a genocidal narcissist, a person willing and able to destroy everyone and everything on the planet as long as it makes him feel momentarily better. That extreme and total endgame narcissism made the oafish man the perfect host for the virus. End of quote. Now, of course, this is funny to read, but then the last 3 days we've been witnessing what is happening in northern Syria, and I feel the need to mention that because I have been working the last 2 years with a film collective from Syria called the Rojava Film Commune, and I've been receiving the last days messages that I really can't describe to you. So it's 3 days now that there's been a genocide practically, and I think it shows the narcissism of the West because both the EU and the US have completely abandoned these peoples. So of course you'll tell me that this is not new. However, the difference between narcissistic authoritarian statism and previous examples of autocratic governance is the creation of a new reality. So it's this idea that Jessup speaks about, and a new idea of normality, especially in relationship to violence. So this is the state of exception that Puladjas speaks about that becomes the norm. Now, why it succeeds? For many, many reasons that we mentioned, but also because we, as neoliberal subjectivities, have been brought to the point of apathy and detachment, therefore facilitate, perpetuate, and mimic this type of statism ourselves. So think of narcissistic authoritarian statism more like a mode of behavior, a model of being, not just for rulers or states or governments, but also ourselves. The psychological drive for success further alienates people from those less affluent and fortunate. A dependent or vulnerable human is seen as a failed human. The capacity to separate individual fate from the fate of others is one hallmark of what psychoanalyst Lynn Layton describes as social narcissism. This also leads to a complete denial of any culpability or responsibility for the living conditions of others or any implication in how they came about to be in such a condition. A new form of apathy is bred through technology because, of course, we scroll down on all these news, but then after 5 minutes, we've completely forgotten and gone to a new subject. So this app optimizes the condition for narcissistic authoritarian statism survival. Neither subjectivities, institutions, nor governments take responsibility for the less fortunate. Now, the first profound example, again, I'm speaking from my place, from where I am in Greece, is the refugee crisis, or rather the European refugee crisis, because there are so many crises all over the planet, and the complete and total apathy of Europe towards the thousands of migrants dying at what many academics are now naming the Black Mediterranean. The second is, of course, climate catastrophe. And it's really interesting that Bruno Latour, in his current book, his latest book, is saying that these are completely and inextricable and very much related to each other. So the new right-wing government in Greece, here I'm giving you a slide from Lesbos. It's only a week and a half ago. It's one of the dozens of examples that actually are currently happening in the country. We have a right-wing government that is very much Bolsonaro-like. So Greece has now, with its new government, declared an all-out war against refugees. They're called illegal migrants. The illegality is quite important. They want to have law and order, which has erupted with hate speech from our prime minister, police raids that evict refugees from squats in the center of Athens. And I will say that these constructions were really made from civil society because there's no help whatsoever in terms of the state. It's a failed state. It's a state in a financial crisis, among other crises. So also there is an attack at the infamous leftist neighborhood of Exarchia. And I would say that the whole of the center of Athens is completely militarized. I mean, you see police everywhere in every corner. Police brutality has increased. And just to give you a little anecdote as well, they made a new police task force that is called Black Panthers. They had the nerve to actually use this name. So the second element through which narcissistic authoritarian statism manifests is climate catastrophe. The inability or unwillingness to act upon the ecological crisis that is occurring before our eyes. Their denial is dumbfounding. Trump's June 2017 Paris Agreement withdrawal was based on a manufactured narrative based on reinforcing the us versus them divide, because he was saying people are attacking US because they want the economics of the US to go bad. And of course dismissing science, because he was saying, okay, yeah, even if we apply all these things that you're asking from us, you know, the change for the environment would be minimal. It's not really worth the effort. Jair Bolsonaro, as well, of Brazil, employed the exact same tactic by using the argument of colonialism when the G7 expressed concerns about the massive fires burning the Amazon. By the way, the fires are still burning the Amazon. While he attacked Brazilian scientists who published reports alerting to the extent of the fires, accusing them of serving foreign interest and spreading lies. So this is an astonishing tactic of appropriating the discourse of the other. Here, of course, is the indigenous who has sovereign right over their land and economy against the evil propaganda of science and other colonizing countries. It's the exact same tactic that defines a narcissistic personality. Twisting truth, and here we can think of science as let's say, an objective fact or a sort of an objective truth, creating a new narrative while blaming the victim for what is happening to them. After the Amazon fires, no responsibility has been acknowledged. Now you're going to ask me, how is all this related with contemporary art? And I will say, well, art is supposedly imitating life or the other way around, right? So we have been seeing this narcissistic authoritarian status profile in the art world as well. The examples are numerous. I don't know why this is red, but doesn't matter. We do not need to look further than Ai Weiwei, and this is an image of his, it's a work of his from 2016. It's a recreation of a photograph depicting the death of Aylan Cordy, which is a 4-year-old Kurdish refugee whose body washed into the shores of Turkey. The child with his parents were trying to transfer from Turkey to Lesbos in Greece, the island, with a boat. Or we can consider, of course, Swiss artist Christoph Buchel's work, Barca Nostra, from 2019. presented at the 2019 Venice Biennial, where he docked basically the very vessel that more than 700 people died in, refugees, on the night of April 18th, 2015. So he just put it in on Venice's piers. Of course, in both cases, the narcissism of the artist is kind of very much into this kind of neoliberal logic. Cultural capital is important, and maybe it's important enough to actually break codes that have to do with human decency and respect towards the dead. Of course, again, I don't know why this is like this, but you're getting the picture. It's an art lover taking a selfie in front of the boat. So I think that's even more an epitome of the narcissist state that we are in. So other recent examples were, of course, corporate actors blending in the art world through donations, showing the amount of force this type of power has. Example, of course, is Warren Kanders of the Whitney Museum, a manufacturer of tear gas, that was ignoring calls to his resignation and stated it's not his fault that the tear gas is used in a bad way. So this is his statement actually when, after the staff of the Whitney Museum published a letter saying, you know, he cannot be the president of the board, we want him out. Or of course we can think of museum directors accused of sexual misconduct during the Me Too campaigns, and still, of course, they find jobs to the day, and these jobs are better paid than the women they actually abused. But thankfully, cultural workers have been siding more with the forces of counter-state formations, creating these other types of hegemonic blocs: activism, collectivism, radical left politics, and feminism. And although neoliberalism has shrunk the possibilities of unionizing, collectivity and the concept of care remain. We see collective actions consistently surfacing through published letters, in situ demonstrations and interventions and petitions and articles in mainstream media. This is Decolonize This Place is a collective with people from all over the world of cultural workers that are basically based in New York. And I think it's one good example of this type of practice. The collective, as it states, resists unethical, neocolonial, and abusive practices within the art institution. Recently, the collective, together with other groups and cultural activists, they managed to get actually Kanders to resign. Another interesting example is artist Meriç Algun, is a Turkish artist that has been for more than a decade documenting through her practice the actual nitty-gritty details of the migrant life in the European Union, especially in the European North, her being Turkish, wanting to get citizenship, so she lives in Sweden. And this is a hand-bound encyclopedia book that is basically presenting visa application forms. I mean, the questions, if you read it, she has been collecting them throughout the world, is, are you considered a good person? This is like a minor question. There are many that are extremely, extremely insulting. She also has another wonderful project. It's called, the whole project is called Becoming European, where she recreated all the stamps of entry and exit in her passport until she got the EU residency, or how many times her name in official letters from the Sweden state was misspelled or mispronounced or written incorrectly, or they were changing completely her name. A recent example, which I find extremely interesting, is AdWatch. It's an initiative really worth noting. It's a platform of artists and researchers Nayantara Ranganathan and Manuel Beltran. It's a seriously researched tool that breaks open Facebook's machine of political persuasion. It's an extremely comprehensive visualization of the political advertisements that appear on the social media platform across 34 countries, presenting an insight into targeted propaganda. And so far, it's only 34 countries because Facebook actually refuses to give data and access from other countries. But of course, they hope that they can somehow start collecting in the second phase of the project. So AdWatch successfully unmasks the tactics of narcissistic authoritarian statism, as in the case when state, parastate, corporate actors, of course, come all together, employing the tool. And I mean, we've seen two examples. Jair Bolsonaro is known to have used WhatsApp campaigns to influence voting, and another recent case is, of course, Boris Johnson, and recent articles that came out that are basically linking him and a company that he works with Facebook. So to go back to the second key feature of narcissistic authoritarian statism, that the normalization of violence with the help of the apathetic neoliberal subjectivity that is us. Informed by Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor from 2011, I'd like to discuss this type of statism through its slow and fast modes of violence. Now, of course, fast violence refers to this immediate and what is commonly known to us as violence, like literal, immediate, manifested through crackdowns on demonstrations, police brutality, anti-abortion legislation, a strong paramilitary arm that performs the dirty work of the state by arresting, imprisoning, murdering, forcefully disappearing dissidents or oppositional politicians and activists, legal loopholes that protect state actors from persecution and collusion, and other examples. It differs from aggressive acts of previous forms of statism in that this time it has two major tools on its side, as I mentioned, technology and of course turbo-capitalism and their effects. Denial is a large part of its modus operandi. Fast violence can also be found in the form of a sudden salary or pension cut, or other fiscal changes like a VAT increase, for example, that instantly changes the living conditions of individuals. Just to give another example from my native Greece, we had more than 200 suicides during the first years of the crisis from people that could not actually pay their loans and they were losing all their property, especially in the island of Crete. The majority of suicides were monitored there. Of course, it can also be seen in military operations, such as those during the War on Terror, overt cooperations, sanctions imposed on other states, hard diplomacy, exclusionary tactics, state-owned multinationals that extract and occupy territories. We only need to look at South America and how many indigenous activists are being murdered as we speak because they're trying to protect their lands. Occupation of land for military bases. Greece, 5 days ago, recently signed for new bases in Crete with Trump. So on and so forth. So slow violence, on the other hand, as defined by Rob Nixon, is, I quote, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Violence is customarily conceived as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular. But we need to change in a different kind of violence, to engage and change our way of thinking with a different kind of violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive, and its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. And a great example is Marwa Arsanios, an artist of Lebanese and Palestinian descent that is based in the US, that responds to climate catastrophe by highlighting the inability of governments and corporations to take responsibility. She documents women's farming collectives that utilize their means and knowledges to carry out what she calls the work of repair. Now, Arsanios researches the modus operandi of such communities and is specifically interested in their view of territory as one that treats land as a subjectivity. And this is interesting to look at because there have been examples. I mean, Kod's Workshop from India is another great example. It's a collective where they are advocating for nature as an entity, a legal entity, as a person that can claim its rights. Arsanios is echoing, of course, the politics of care and repair that we mentioned before, prominent in feminist histories. For the 2019 Warsaw Biennial, where we see here, she organized an assembly of ecofeminists, climate activists, and scientists, along with women farmers from Syria, Lebanon, Mexico, India, Greece, and Poland, to exchange knowledge about how they communally live and cooperate and how they create infrastructures. Small groups such as these, focused on developing alternative structures, offer counter-proposals to the continuous negligence of narcissistic authoritarian statism and its climate change denial. So artistic practice can be seen as a performative action of whistleblowing, unmasking, mocking, resisting, but also proposing, reimagining, and reconditioning a future form of power that remains still at our grasp. if we aim to see the role of the cultural worker not only as agent provocateur, but as an author of an imaginary or imaginary forms of redistribution of power, I really believe we still have hope for the future, which looks quite bleak, I have to say. But what if culture can not only build a contra-narrative, but also offer an otherwise redistributed power structure in essence? What if it can actually create a counter-hegemonic bloc? Not just for us to imagine it and act on it. For me, a great example of that is the work of forensic architecture. Forensic architecture is a research agency. They don't claim themselves as artists. We would say they are somewhere in between culture and academia. They're a multinational, international group between British, Israeli, Greek, Mexican, from all different disciplines. And what they've been doing is they're documenting what they themselves call cartographies of violence. So acting against a lacking, corrupt, or weakened judicial system and authoritarianism. So the group undertakes advanced architectural and media research on behalf of international prosecutors, human rights organizations, and political and environmental justice groups, as well as citizens or their families, such in the case of Pavlos Fyssas. Here we see a clip from their investigation. Pavlos Fyssas was a rapper, an anti-fascist rapper, that was murdered in 18th of September 2013 in Athens by a member of the neo-Nazi group Golden Dawn called George Roupakias. I will just say that the murder occurred in 2013, and 5 years later, the trial of the Golden Dawn is still going on. Today, as we speak, is the defending statements of the defendants. And with this government, we're not hoping for a good result, I have to say. They also did another investigation of LGBTQI activist Zach Kostopoulos, an HIV activist and an incredible drag performer, that was murdered in 21st of September 2018, so just a year ago, in the center of Athens, not by people that we know for sure were neo-Nazi party members, but they were definitely neo-nationalist in other kind of marginal parastate groups. Currently, Forensic Architecture are having their first solo major exhibition in Greece at State of Concept Athens, and they're presenting a new and older versions and investigations of their work that unfold this space of slow and fast violence. I'm showing a slide here of the herbicidal warfare in Gaza. That is one of their most recent projects that just finished. It's basically a documentation of what Israel has been doing for the last 20 years, which is through pesticides. They're trying to clear whole places of land in order to have visibility in the Gaza Strip. But by doing that, of course, they are destroying any crop that there is there, which means that the livelihood of the people that are mostly farmers is annihilated, but also they are creating cancers. And this is an excellent example of slow violence, because these cancers in the population have been developing very, very slowly the last decade. So they're interested on such violences, and mostly because they're very much unseen, as we said, both in terms of ecocide, destruction of cultural heritage. Another fantastic example is the collaboration of the Israel state with Google and Google Maps, because in particular areas of the Nakab Desert, we're off the Gaza Strip now, we're going towards Syria, there are communities of Bedouins that are basically, these particular parts, they don't have high-res resolution. This is the deal that they made with Google Earth, so that they're trying to basically delete the presence of these villages there that have been in their area since 1910. So what Forensic Architecture is trying to do is find older photographs from RAF, the Royal, I don't know how it's called, the British Royal Aviation, whatever, before 1948, so before the creation of the Israeli state, in order to prove that there is actual proof that these communities were living there. And not only that, but the way that they were constructing their homes is a cultural heritage. just to give another example. Another big project that they've been doing, which has been separating itself now, it's called forensic oceanography, and it's extremely interesting for me, from where I come, from my locality, is how NGOs are being criminalized at the moment in Europe because they're trying to help refugees. And maybe some of you know or heard of the case of Sea-Watch with Carola Rackete, that was recently imprisoned in Italy because she was the captain of Sea-Watch. Sea-Watch is a German NGO that is basically employing ships to go and save people between the Libyan and Italian borders. And what is even more horrifying than what is happening between Greece and Turkey is that, of course, Libya is in a very difficult political state at the moment, and there is a deal that they're keeping. It's exactly the same in Turkey in that sense, that they're keeping refugees in their soil. But what they're doing is that they actually have reincarnated, for lack of a better word, slavery. So you have people that are basically sold, human people, human lives that are sold in Libya. So they're very eager, of course, to get all these boats because every person in there equals money for them. So it's imperative, I think, that we become radically aware of our operations within and outside the institution as cultural workers. We should seek for bodies of work, institutional and curatorial practices that propose, imagine, enact, or even foresee forms of counter-narratives and creation of counter-hegemonic blocks against the increasing power of narcissistic authoritarian statism that is unfortunately enacted in the art world itself. And I hope that the examples presented here demonstrate that we are capable of, at least if that is the only thing we can do, probing the imaginary for different cultural power blocks, counter-hegemonic power blocks that are, as a friend recently told me, the unexpected ally of civil society. Thank you very much.